Welcome to Building Blocks for Dynamic Leadership. In this series, I'm talking about dynamic leadership from the perspective of helping small business owners adopt it. A few weeks ago, I did a hot take and said dynamic leadership is the best approach for small businesses who are interested in scaling. Now, there's some distinctions in there that I want to make. I'll start out with that today because there's so much written about leadership. And when you look at all the infographics and all the do this and don't do that, there's very little that people disagree with. But at the same time, we know that under pressure, most people don't use all of what they know. Most people have trouble accessing their full agency when they're in a stress response. And depending on the size and magnitude of the stress response and the threat or the risk that's perceived by our subconscious, that can have a big influence on that. So my point here is to have something that works on a bad day of a bad week. Yes, all the great platitudes about leadership, you can't disagree with them. But if I can't implement them on a bad day of a bad week in a stress response, then it's just good to know stuff. And to know and not do is not that much better than not knowing. The objective here today is this is called the Dynamic Leadership Building Blocks. What I wanted to do is provide a template that you can use to start building your own version of dynamic leadership. One is that it's easy to apply, it's easy to implement, it can be very intuitive, it's flexible. And those are some of the same reasons why people don't like it or why it's not getting the press that it should get, in my opinion. And I think it's more of a nimble type approach, better for small businesses, and I'm saying under 400 employees, and it's give or take because we have outsourcing and different things, but the point is if you use that number, it makes sense. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work above that, but the real advantages are below because of the flexibility. So we want to make sure that we're using it the way it's intended, and that's what we'll be talking about today. The other thing is I wanted something that would align with the team metaphor. So I often talk about the difficulty that arises when you have a family metaphor or a political metaphor or a command and control metaphor. Those evolve and they come about for different reasons. You can go back and look at some of the manufacturing days in the US, heavy manufacturing time, lots of layers of leadership, and you can see why the command and control would happen. And you even have a bureaucratic style where leaders just feel like they have to put steps in place. It's never executing, never pulling the trigger, just steps. And there's some reinforcement out of that because the more times you review a presentation or the more times you review an idea, you see and you pick up things that you didn't see before. So there's some reinforcement that keeps that going. But when you're talking about a VUCA environment, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, we don't have the luxury of taking all those steps to put something in place. Now, at the same time, we don't want to rush. There's a point that's made in the book Think and Grow Rich, and a lot of people take this to heart. And I agree with the statement, but you have to make sure that you're thinking about it right, in my opinion. And it's that successful people make decisions very quickly and change them very slowly, if at all. Now, that statement by itself supports Ready, Fire, Aim. And I like Ready, Fire, Aim. But you have to have some parameters around it. You've got to have some guiding principles when you apply it. If you just, as a business owner, you go out and tell your people, hey, we're doing Ready, Fire, Aim, or we're making decisions quickly and we're not going to change them. What we're leaving off, in my opinion, is that, yes, you make decisions very quickly after a full or proper assessment. Now, how big is that assessment? Well, like Einstein says, if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes talking about and defining the problem, and he'd spend 5 minutes on the solution. Obviously, that ratio is not going to hold as you have more and more time. When you have days, you're not going to spend 5 days talking about it, the problem, in 1 day implementing the solution. But the point is made that you have to make sure you do an adequate assessment. And too often, people make the assessment too fast, and they're making the assessment based on associations. One of the events, it talks about high performance with the 7 fitness areas, And in there, I talk about how you could break that cycle of making responses that are equal to the reaction, which is often a survival response. In other words, if I get a cue and I go into threat mode, my reaction is going to be a survival response. It's definitely not using good conscious thinking. It's an association, but associations by definition, they're from the past. Our habits and associations were created in the past. And some of them were locked in from age 0 to 7, some of our beliefs and all that. So we're making decisions now about doing something that's well above the line, clearly in an area that we didn't contemplate from 0 to 7. And we're making decisions based on a reaction to a threat. So it's probably going to be wrong. So we want to have that space. And that's why I talk about personal leadership as one of the first building blocks, by the way, when I get to that slide, personal leadership and agency, because you have to have personal leadership and agency. And when you're making a decision out of that and with the proper assessment, now I can agree with make the decision quickly. Once you have the data, you make the decision quickly and you change it very slowly, if at all. Then I get it. And I hope you see that distinction as well. I think it's an important one to make sure you're having that conversation with your folks. Quick review, if you weren't there last week, we talked about the self-determination theory. Another reason I like dynamic leadership is I wanted something that dovetailed well with self-determination theory, because self-determination theory, one, is very intuitive, but it's very important because it provides the three pillars for intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is not just internal motivation. Intrinsic motivation means I'm finding enjoyment from the activity itself. You talk to people about riding motorcycles, we'll get on a motorcycle. It doesn't take much of a destination. Any destination is fine. It's just a reason to get out on the bike, because riding is enjoyment. And so, we're going to this destination that we're going to enjoy being at, but the ride is going to be the highlight of the entire trip. So when you think about creating that kind of environment in your workplace, then you start understanding why dynamic leadership and self-determination theory are so important, and why I think as a small business owner, we want to be considering the dynamic leadership. Now, the other reason that this is important, because as a small business owner, and let's say we're talking about 400 and below, 400 employees and below, and you're at that 10 or 15 mark, you've already hired your manager, or you're planning on hiring a manager. When you hire that manager, what are you going to tell them? You're going to tell them about you're running with the team metaphor, or you're going to tell them about how you're going to under promise and over deliver? How are you going to articulate those things? Or are you going to let the person come in and do what they do? See, we hire leaders. We hire everybody. We hire leaders largely based on what their conditioning is. If you look at a leader who's applying for a position, and you look at where they got those skills, and you ask them what kind of leadership training did they have, they'll have had some training. But when you look at the ratio of training and development and how it was applied versus what they actually do and where they learned that, which was probably from experience and mentoring and et cetera, we're hiring people based on their conditioning largely. And that conditioning was for something in the past, and we're making it work for now. But if you're building an organization and you're at 10 people and you're planning to go to 400, doesn't it make sense to do that in a purposeful way, in a way that you're thinking about what you want the culture to be? If you have a leader that comes from a command and control environment, and another leader came from a sort of political or bureaucratic environment, and another leader came from maybe a family type environment where there's a patriarch mentality going on and favoritism, and then you have another leader who's coming from an environment where by any means necessary, right? The end always justifies the means. And this is where I've literally sat in meetings with people and their first solution is to come up with telling the stakeholders a lie. That was their first. Now, how do you do that? How does a person get to that point? Well, it's been reinforced. They've been in environments. Now, suppose you hire a leader. You don't realize that they have this metaphor playing in the back of their mind. And as a leader that you hire, you're with them sometimes, but they've got freedom of action. And now they're doing these kinds of things, and it creates disruption. This is how you end up with, not the way, but this contributes to a toxic culture. Now you have one team operating this way, like command and control, another team operating, trying to be a family, which is really difficult because how do you deal with performance issues with a family? And then you've got this other group dealing with this any means necessary. And when the employees are eating lunch together, how do they reconcile all that? So I can go on and on. The point is, I like the self-determination theory. Now, if you've looked at any lists that talk about where pay is in terms of importance to the employee, pay is usually in the second half of the list. If it's top 5 things, I would say it's 3 or 4. If it's top 20 things, it's in double digits. Not always, but just do some surveys, look at it. Pay is low. And if you look at the stages of motivation, no motivation at all, external motivation, incentives, whatever you want to add in there. I'll put in some compliance stuff, some teamwork, these things, recognition of activity, integration with beliefs, and inherent enjoyment. Inherent enjoyment is where intrinsic motivation resides. Now, I'll tell you that this doesn't mean you have to have 100% enjoyment no, you can do it with 5% overlap. If you can find overlap between the task that they're doing and something that has meaning in their life, their purpose or something like that, they can find enjoyment in doing the activity. That's why self-determination theory is a topic, because with self-determination theory, what we're talking about is the autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when those 3 pillars, when those 3 are present, the person's intrinsic motivation goes up. So it doesn't have to be the activity, like riding the motorcycle. It doesn't have to be the motorcycle. It could be have a person having the right kind of choices about the route that they take as they drive to this destination. That could bring joy. Maybe the person didn't want to go to that destination, but now they get to choose the route. Or maybe then the competence, right? Sometimes some people like driving, some people like being in the passenger seat. That feeling of competence while driving and being able to drive in a spirited way, if that's what turns you on, that can add to the enjoyment of the trip. So you're seeing that it's not necessarily that I'm driving to this destination and the destination has to be 100% enjoyment. We could make the journey enjoyable. And then relatedness, having good conversation, listening to music that I like, listening to books on tape, whatever it is, having some kind of a relatedness feeling. Because with books on tape, if you're listening to an autobiography, you sort of have this mentoring thing going on with the speaker. So you're seeing that we can introduce intrinsic motivation by focusing on autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Similarly, if I drop down the competence or I drop down relatedness, I'm taking joy out of the activity and I'm actually getting a minus. Now the person has a job that they're tolerating it works, it's okay, but it's not the best, but they put up with it. And then you start taking away relatedness, or you have it in a situation where they don't feel competent, or maybe you're micromanaging. Now you're sucking the life out of them. The summary, self-determination theory, remember, it's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Intrinsic motivation is enjoyment from the activity itself. Extrinsic motivation would be, other than that, incentive motivation. One of the things about incentives, I've done sales operations for most of my career, sales and then sales operations. So I've been on the receiving end of bonuses and commissions and trips and they have got these double trips, which I think is a great tool because people will go after this trip, but then you still want to provide something for those real high achievers to give them like a super trip. And then you're going to have another one up here. And the reason why they do that is because people leave money on the table. you come up with the best commission structure. You're going to have people leave money on the table. Even your high producers, they'll leave money on the table. So we have to introduce other incentives. But when you get to intrinsic motivation, I could get that money off the table with intrinsic motivation. It may not come off with incentives. And that's the takeaway for you, is that building from the ground up with autonomy, competence, and relatedness, you can have your producers taking that money off the table, not leaving it there, which is what happens with incentives, commission, bonuses, etc. A lot of times people don't even understand the bonus structure. They understand it enough to make sure that they're making their money, but if they can't describe it, it's certainly not motivating them. Just think about that. And then others I've seen where it gets so complex because you're trying to balance profitability or quality along with the growth. You want the growth in revenue, but we want the quality or the profitability of the business. And when you put that burden on the salesperson, they could tank because you get this cognitive dissonance and it becomes just there. It's not even an incentive anymore. This is why the best practice would be you have the salespeople running on growth, and then you have another area that takes care of the quality. You want to separate those two out. Otherwise, you try to incent both and you get less of both. So autonomy, competence, and relatedness, take a screenshot of that slide if you like. And then that causes intrinsic motivation to go up. And with intrinsic motivation, they have the internal need to grow and attain fulfillment. Quick summary: autonomy empowers leaders and employees to make choices. And it's simple as that, letting them make some choices. You're going to define the what, but they can talk about the how. You can even give them two choices on the how. You could do something as simple as, well, come back to me with the solution. I want to have an ideal solution, and then come up with a no-cost solution. Just asking for them, their input is going to increase their feeling of autonomy and their competence. And guess what? If you listen to the solution, which you should do, that improves the relatedness. And you're putting autonomy, competence, and relatedness into the situation without extra work, without taking away from what you're attempting to do. And then intrinsic motivation, as I said, it aligns personal values with organizational goals. But the thing I want you to remember is that it's about people finding enjoyment in the activity itself. The point about personal goals, the activities now align with my personal goals. People pursue their personal goals. They spend money to pursue their personal goals. You ever see somebody training for a triathlon or a marathon, bicycle races? The amount of work they put into that, wouldn't you love them to put that kind of work into your operation? You watch young adults playing video games. They can sit there for hours and hours playing a video game. It's tying into that autonomy, competence, and the relatedness. That's why they've got the streaming. They're talking to other people, and it's all there. Everything is right there, and they can spend hours and hours. Wouldn't you want to take that and put it into your business? See, they have the capability, and they have the desire. What we have to do is create the work environment to do that, and there's reasons why we don't. And now we're going to get into the program. So I was looking for a leadership process that allowed that to happen, and the other thing I wanted was to be able to apply the best practices from coaching. You get a room of coaches together, and you give them some business problems. They're all going to come up with similar solutions, and most of those solutions will have something to do with getting involvement and engagement from the people. You can map it back to the self-determination theory. Before I go onto the slide, I'll also say, see what we're doing, and I recommend selling the same way. You don't want to lead the way you want to lead. You want to lead the way people want to be led. People don't mind being led, just like people don't mind being sold, but they want to buy in the way that they want to buy. And people want to follow in the way that they want to follow. So you have to lead them in a way that's aligned with how they want to be led. And if that doesn't sound fair, well, that's the role of the leader. This is what we have to do. There's a disadvantage for small businesses, and that disadvantage is revenue per employee. Look at the small business, the amount of revenue per employee at the lower end. Even here at $150,000 and $250,000, and you're attracting leaders, you're looking to hire leaders. But look what happens when you get up into the larger companies. And 500 million is not very big when you, in the grand scheme of things. But these guys at 100 million, $300,000 or $400,000 per employee. Now, while I'm not suggesting that that's what they want, it allows for some tolerance of poor performance. You have a buffer, you have room. They have room to have people sitting around doing nothing, with the life sucked out of them because they're using micromanaging techniques. You don't have that luxury as a small business. You need to be firing on all cylinders, and not only that, you need people who want to step up and who are identifying problems. The large corporations have legal teams and HR teams and compliance teams. They've got a board and they've got consultants. They have all these people looking out for them. There's so many different ways for threats to enter into the organization's awareness that they're going to find out. In a small business, you don't have all of that first line of defense that's out there looking out for you. You need to hear from your employees, but in order to do that, you have to have a process. Advantage of small businesses is that there's one leader and one voice. So when we talk about team metaphor, when I lay out guiding principles for my team, everybody can be on the same page. An advantage and disadvantage for large businesses is that they have a board. Now, look at this. You got this leader is the one who's speaking to the teams, and they're making the decisions. But you have this board. Now, all boards are not created equal. Some boards are there to really help that leader reach his or her goals. Other boards are there and they're taking on that role of responsibility to the shareholder, and they're taking it seriously. And they're making tough decisions at that board level. And when you have a board that puts the CEO in place and they put the C-suite in place, well, you know that board has a lot of control and say over what goes on into the organization. And that can become a disadvantage because now we have this situation where, I'm going to go to the pad. So if you think about having a continuum, you have this continuum. And on one side, we have the employees. On the other side, we have the owner. And most people would agree that we have this tension in the middle. We have this tension where employees want higher pay, they want more work that's more fun, they want fewer hours, they want all these things, and we can't give them all of that because if we did, we wouldn't be serving the owner. The owner, on the other hand, they want more profit, they want more revenue, they want workers working more time without getting overtime. I shouldn't say that. And again, the owner can't do all these things because the employees won't be served, they won't stay around. So there's this sort of loose, unspoken compromise that happens, and there's some tension going both ways. And that's cool. There's some tension going both ways. And sometimes things get tough and we've got to move this area a little bit towards the profitable side or the growth side. When I say things get, maybe it's a big opportunity, maybe we're putting something out there, maybe we've got to correct something, maybe we've lost a supplier and we have to find a new supplier, we need people to suck it up for a while, whatever, and we need to move that over to the other side. And other times, things are going well and we're able to move things towards the employee. And this ebb and flow, it sort of works. But then we have this other, when you have a board, and this is not all boards, as I said, all boards are not created equally. But now you have this board over here, and they have an agenda. That agenda could be the same as the owner, probably is in a small business, but the larger the corporation, especially as you get into mergers and acquisitions and people on the board, maybe they're on other boards as well, and you don't really know if the decision is really about what's right for the customer or if this is some other reason here in the board. And, you've seen situations where companies just suddenly go out of business. Like, bam. Well, somebody probably knew that was coming, but if you told the group, they would tank. When this happens, I'm not going to say it's in all cases. This is an illustration just to kind of give you an idea. But when we're operating in this kind of a situation, and depending on the nature of that board and the relationship with the CEO. Now, sometimes the board, the chairman, is also the CEO. And other times the board got rid of the CEO founder and they put another CEO in place. And when you have investors and, there's just a lot of complexity that goes on that small businesses don't have. I'm pausing here to take this moment because when you look at it this way, you understand why, as a small business owner, some of the leadership best practices that you come across don't really apply. They don't work. And we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater because we've tried this stuff and it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work at the small business level is because this here area can be skewed way over here. So now you have to do other things. This tension has moved way over here. So now employees are not getting their needs met. It's an environment that's unpleasant for them. It's the opposite of the intrinsic motivation. This is where you get people are just going through the motions. They're spending most of their time, some of their time looking for another job. All that stuff that happens, they're just checked out. And these are people who run their personal lives just fine. They plan their vacations sometimes 2 and 3 years in advance, traveling to foreign countries for 14 days, and they're doing just fine. They don't ask you what to do. They figure it out. They're not needing somebody to micromanage them. They have a great time. These are people who know how to live their life. They know how to solve problems. But because we've micromanaged them, why are we micromanaging? Because one of the reasons that if this board is in that space, they need compliance. And if you have a board that also puts the leaders in place, there's a political element that happens. And so this leader is now, they're double-minded because they have to take care of what the board wants, and then they're trying to build a high-performing team. Now, this is not about the large corporations. My point is that small businesses have an advantage over the large corporation, generally speaking, because they don't have that tension and they're able to take care of the employee. You start talking about doing some intrinsic motivation for employees, and it's a political environment with the board that has a lot of power, and it's going to be flat. It's just not going to land well. Understand your environment. Now, it doesn't mean dynamic leadership doesn't work in a large corporation. It's just that in a large corporation, you have to spend a certain amount of time leading upward. But you know what? You can apply these same principles leading upward. And that's what networking, that's where networking comes into play, or how, other options. I don't want to get into it. So we've got the advantage and disadvantage for large and small businesses, that board. And the reason it's an advantage, of course, is because you have all this thinking, you have this mentoring, you have access to capital, you have support, you have people looking out for you. So I'm not against a board. As a matter of fact, small companies, I think you should get a board early. Get one person. Just have one person that you think of as a board. So, we want to look at, maybe it's a mentor, but remember, mentors should have done it before. You don't necessarily need a mentor requirement for them to be on the board. The board is more like a sponsor. So if you have a coach, the coach brings out the best in you. A mentor has done it before and can show you the ropes, whereas the sponsor is the one who signs their name on the check or the bottom line to advocate for you. So your board is more like that. Your board is somebody more who has some knowledge, some power, some awareness, some network that they can maybe tap into to help you out, as well as do the mentoring as needed and ask you the tough questions. Here are some core actions that small business owners can take. We can define roles and responsibilities. Obviously, it ensures every team member knows their specific role, leading to accountability and discipline. In practice, well-defined job roles, regular performance reviews, and the culture of accountability. When you look at a team, when I look at the metaphor for team, and you look at the differences between a team and an organization, or say a business company, teams have an opponent. As a business or a company, you have a competitor, but it's not the same. Not in most cases. I mean, in politics now, we're seeing people taking big shots at each other. But if you think about even two companies that are competing, they don't necessarily try to undo the other person. Now, sometimes there's always bad actors, and bad actors are going to do bad things. But generally speaking, they're not doing things to unravel your strategies. They're just countering your strategies with things that they're doing. Whereas a team, when you go out there, you have a clear offense and a clear defense. There's definitely somebody trying to stop your play. It takes a lot more thought to put into your plays than it does in business. What we want to do is start bringing some of that discipline that you have on a team, and a sports team, into business. Promote continuous improvement. This is a part of it. Encourage learning, resilience, and adaptability for high performance under pressure. Regular training, stress management programs, agile project management. You want to have ways to constantly improve. You don't want to get locked in, especially as a small business, because remember, you don't have the fluff when it comes to the revenue per employee. And then build a team culture and motivation. Cultivate camaraderie and trust to boost morale and performance. Team building activities, collaborative environments, employee recognition programs, but we're not talking about going through the motions. Habits are to people as culture is to the organization. And habits, for most of us, formed willy-nilly. We got a download from age 0 to 7. We had some good things and bad things happen. We build a prefrontal cortex in our 20s. Now we have some I don't want self-control and some I do want self-control and some willpower. And then the dopamine and serotonin comes in and it forms our habits. When you go to a team, they'll break some of those bad habits. I remember reading something about a football coach for a college program, and if the player didn't have, I was talking about linemen, if the guard did not have the innate ability to pull, he wouldn't take that person. He wouldn't take them on the team because it was too hard in 4 years to teach them to become a pulling guard. Just an example. My point is, teams are going to take the time to condition in the responses and the behaviors that they want. I would say that as a company, small business, we should be looking at every day is preparing for the big game. Now, when is the big game? The big game is when that person gets something, a cue or stimulus or some event that's bigger than what they can handle. That's their big game. So we're always practicing. The way you practice is the way you perform. The point is, we want to treat every day preparing this person for that big game. Everyone that you hire should be able to access their capabilities on a good day of a good week. You shouldn't have hired them if they can't. You wouldn't have hired them if they can't. But what percentage of your team can access the best of what they have on a bad day of a bad week that happens to show up in a bad month? When they're at the edge, at the margin for stress response, how many people can actually access best of what they have, that personal leadership in their agency? That's what you want to train. That's what you want to build on, because you're only as good as you can perform on the bad day of a bad week. And we all know that nothing says that there's only going to be 1 day or 1 week like that. You're going to have 5 days in a week. Now, fostering intrinsic motivation in your organization. And all of this is motherhood and apple pie, but I'm talking to you now about it in the context of self-determination theory, and as the leader putting these things in place, not just to put them in place, but to cultivate a culture of high performance, like a team that's always preparing their people for the big game. And the big game, I'll reveal on the last slide when I talk about the 6 building blocks. Celebrate achievement to foster a sense of accomplishment. Provide opportunities for growth and learning. Make employees feel valued and invest in their long-term success. One of the things I think is important is to have a development plan for everybody. Everyone should have, everyone, a 24-month development plan. Now, some people are only going to have 4 things to accomplish. Some leaders are coming to you so equipped, they're only going to have 4 things to accomplish, 1 every 6 months. Other people might have something every month, and maybe a new employee might have something that's development 2 or 3 times a month. Everybody should have a development plan, because now you're building this stair step and you're creating a culture of continuous improvement and not arrived. See, if you start telling people you've done a great job, doing a good job, in their mind, they've arrived. And that tension to learn and get better can go away. And now we're losing some of that intrinsic motivation. What we want to do is, you're doing that well. That's step A. You got that step A down pat. We're ready to move on to B. And now we're doing B. And by the way, you've got some skills in C. C is going to come out there, but you're already learning to do this and this. Because you have a development plan, you already know what A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K looks like. You have it laid out. And they should have some of that information as well, so they know that there's more to work on. What it does is it allows you to keep them in a growth mindset, because you get out of this focusing on the result and you're able to spend more time on effort. And if you know anything about the growth mindset, it's about effort. It's focusing on effort and fostering that kind of an attitude. Even just adding the word yet when you say, well, you're not quite there yet. Adding that word yet can help foster a growth mindset. See, we want to keep people in that growth mindset. You're not going to have intrinsic motivation when you're in a fixed mindset because you're in protection mode. And when you're in protection mode, you're just not looking on the outlook for good things. Flexible employee empowerment, encourage ownership and self-motivation. This is an important step. I don't want to belabor the point here, but we have leaders. I've run into leaders who say that they are empowering their team, but when you actually look at what happens, when the team makes a mistake, they have such a negative reaction, and it's not intended. It's just that they don't have the skills to pause before reacting, and then that reaction of, oh my gosh, becomes their response, and now they're justifying that response. This is what I talk about in self-coaching, is you've got to be able to have that pause so you're not letting people see that reaction, because the reaction is from your associations, which are from the past, which could be tied to limiting beliefs you had from age 0 to 7, which have absolutely nothing to do right now, but yet you're putting all this stress on the employee because of that reaction. And employees, your voice, your messaging has so much leverage with employees, and now you've got this person from a relatedness standpoint, dinged. From a competence standpoint, dinged. From an autonomy standpoint, dinged. Because they're not going to take any chances anymore. They feel incompetent, and they certainly feel like they're disconnected from you. And now you being the leader, in their mind, you can fire them at a moment's notice, whether it's true or not. That's how the subconscious works. It just wires this stuff up like that. You're their livelihood. You represent their livelihood, and now they're in an existential crisis just because you didn't handle your reaction real well, and you let them see not anything that had to do with them making the mistake. You flashed on to the conversation you're going to have with the CEO. And anyway, like I did say, I wasn't going to belabor that point. So there we go. Flexible work arrangements, offer control, and I think people can earn this. When you start looking at autonomy, people can earn that. Career pathing, definitely have some career pathing, and be comfortable with it. Everybody's not cut out to be the leader of the department. Just like on a team, you have people on the bench, and they're happy to be on the team. They know that they're not as good as the starting lineup. They know that, and they're working on it. And they're hoping they get their shot. And when the shot comes, hopefully they're ready. It's okay to tell a person you're not really what we're looking for, and here's some things that we can help you with, and this is an area that you might want to consider. And it's a development conversation. When you have a development plan, they're always getting better. And one of the things I strongly advocate is finding out what people's purposes. What would they do if they knew they couldn't fail? What kind of work would they be doing if they didn't have to get paid? You want to know that so you can organize the work around what they like, and that goes a long way to back into that competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Cultural alignment, align the organization's culture with values and purpose to foster internal motivation. And then diversity and inclusion initiatives. And again, making sure we're not going through the motions, but we're doing this in such a way with that self-determination theory in mind. And that's why, again, I like it with dynamic leadership, because you can forget this slide, but if I can get you to remember autonomy, competence, relatedness, and how is the action you're about to take going to impact that, you intuitively can answer that. So can your employees. The same way they can figure out how to navigate a country for 14 days where they don't speak the language, they can figure that one out too. And here's the building blocks for the dynamic leadership. Empowerment and autonomy is what you have to have as a leader. You have to be able to access your agency and then adopt habits that support personal leadership, not only in yourself, but bring it out in others as well. And this is that pause between the stimulus and the reaction, and the reaction and the response. Your reaction should not equal your response in a stimulus response cycle. The reaction happens is that's subconscious. Then that becomes a data point. Then you make your real choice after that. And we're talking about a half a second pause. We're not talking about minutes. It's a half a second, because the unconscious reaction time is about a quarter of a second, and the conscious mind picks up on it in about a half second. So that's why I said within a half second, you've had your plenty of time to make an assessment, a quick assessment, not a full one, a quick assessment. Should I delay it? Let's take it offline later. Should I dump it? It's not important. Let's not talk about it. Should I do it? Yes, we're going to take action right now because this is important. Or should I delegate it? We're going to give this to that other team and let them work through it. So 4Ds: do it, dump it, delegate it, or delay it. You can make that all in that 1 second stimulus response. Onboarding: definitely have a strong onboarding. Provide clear autonomy. Use iterative feedback and coaching. So if you have a development plan and you share that development plan, at least the first part of it, phase one, in the onboarding, you're putting them into a growth mindset, because every time they come in, they're working on getting better, and there's a benefit for effort. And now you're not stuck on expecting everybody to get an A. See, that A mentality, everybody has to get an A, because they've come from a school environment where 70% is passing, and now all of a sudden you need an A just to be okay. So then what does it take to get, more than okay? And if you have a development plan, you're literally building this culture of continuous improvement, because you're not waiting for them to get to A level results. If they're putting in the A level effort, that may be enough. And then you have gating. I use the example of teaching a kid to ride a bicycle. If you took a kid and you had the bicycle over there without the training wheels, and you're just waiting for them to learn how to ride, it's not going to happen. But if you could get them with the training wheels and have them learn to pedal, make sure they pedal faster, let them wiggle the handlebars a little bit, maybe move the training wheels up off the ground slightly so they can wobble, and tell them to wiggle the handlebars, and maybe take them to a hill and let them pedal downhill, you can have a kid riding a bicycle in 5 days. But you don't take them to the next step until they can do the prior step. And if they can't pedal fast enough, they're not ready to take off the training wheels, because it won't be fast enough to keep balance. If they can't wiggle the handlebars, they're going to have a harder time balancing, because that's essentially what's happening in the micro movement. It's just slightly moving the handlebars, but if you get that muscle memory going, you get the point. So we want to have a development plan with some gating. You don't do the next thing until they can do the prior step, at least at an A level of effort. It doesn't necessarily have to be on results, because with results, there's external factors. But that onboarding is very, very important, and you keep them in that growth mindset. Task assignment facilitates skill development. So you don't just delegate to people, you want to have a transfer of responsibility and assignment, and there's a process. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. Feedback and development is huge. I talk about blue language. So you don't want to just give feedback. If I tell somebody you've done a great job, those words get tied back to me. There's a dopamine that happens, a dopamine release that happens, but the dopamine release is connected to me. If I say, the way you picked up on the fact that XYZ was missing, and you took the initiative to go to the other department and get that XYZ and put it in place, and then put it all back together without even being told, that's the kind of work we need. I appreciate that. I'm glad you did. Thank you. Now, that behavior just got conditioned because the dopamine release went to that behavior. This is like conditioning a team. You don't have a coach just stand there talking about it. They actually do it. And then they have instant feedback. That's why deep practice works, because the feedback is instant. If you play a piano piece and there's one section that you're messing up on, don't keep practicing the entire piece, because the dopamine release gets diluted. Practice that one piece over and over until you can get it perfect. Then slow it down and do it perfectly. And then skip a note and do it perfectly. That's deep practice, and you're getting instant feedback, and your neurons get wrapped with myelin. They fire faster, more accurately, and with more strength. That gets back to the personal leadership. We talk about neuroplasticity in the personal leadership, and that neuroplasticity works on you as the leader, but it also enables you to pull the best out of your people as well. So that was feedback and development. Operational excellence, project management, and I like to think of it as project leadership, but we want to make sure that you're aware of when you're talking about project work versus when you're talking about operational work, because it's different. And the big game I was talking about, 10x is possible. That 10x result is possible because you don't have an opponent, and you become your own opponent. So you get rid of that. You don't want to be fighting against yourself. You want everybody going in that same direction. And that's, if you look at Good to Great by Jim Collins and Great by Choice and use that as a model, you'll see that within that flywheel and the simplicity and the consistency and the 20-mile march that he talks about in those books, and the bullets and then cannons, you've got the template for 10x. But you're not going to do it with micromanaging. You're not going to do it with relying on external motivation, because remember, external motivation is only number 2 in the 6 stages of motivation. So the feedback, observation-based, 3-to-1 ratio, that's positive to negative. Observation-based was my point about telling them why it's a good job. Not that it's a good job, but the fact that they were able to make that sale in 2 calls rather than 4, which is the average. That shows some definite skill, and you wanted to acknowledge them for it. And then the growth mindset, using the word yet and doing other things, focusing on the effort, or at least acknowledging the effort. Even when the results aren't there, pay attention to the effort. You want to keep reinforcing the effort. Results, if you think about sales, you got a closing ratio of 20%. You're only getting a sale every 5th time. If they're waiting on result for a feel good, that doesn't work. You want to start paying attention to the things that they do well, even when the sale doesn't happen. This is the kind of language that may be foreign when you have a board that's up there, because the board is focused on results, and that's their job. As the leader that's building a team that's going to be able to achieve 10x results, you've got to be able to dilute some of that. They can't take that board conversation full strength. Empowerment progressive, that's the development plan, step by step, like riding the bicycle. You want to keep moving them up. And then capability based. So you definitely want to, that's that back to what's their skill, and tying it to that skill. The relatedness, you're seeing them. The competence, you're tying it back to a skill. The autonomy, they earn freedom of action with that. I mentioned the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So when you have these development plans, as you're going through it, and that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 could be the first week, I'm going to meet with you 5 days, the second week 4 days, the third week 3 days, the next week 2 days, and then 1 day. That 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 could be in 1 week. I'm going to meet with you 4 or 5 times on Monday, and then we're going to meet 4 times on Tuesday, and then 3 times on Wednesday, and then, you know what I'm saying? You could do it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 over 6 months. Whatever it is, have some kind of a way of training wheels to riding the bike without the training wheels, to handling the bike well, to handling it like a pro. That's that development plan that you're always having, that cycle that you want to have in your mind. And then the checkpoints. I think every company should have checkpoints. In California, they have a very high bar to become an exempted employee, where you don't, in other words, not hourly salary employee. And that bar is so high that we have some things like people like store managers, total freedom of action, but they're still an hourly worker. And hourly workers tend not to get checkpoint meetings and don't have performance management, because they're paid by the hour, and the hour rate changes, and then the pay changes. You're leaving money on the table if you're not doing checkpoint meetings. Checkpoint meetings are a way for you to talk about preparation for that big game. And remember, the big game is being able to do 10x. And when does it come? You don't know. But there's always going to be a bad day of a bad week. And when that happens, that's sometimes your opportunity to shine. And when you can shine, you take advantage of it. And I had mentioned development plans. So there you go. That was a lot to talk about. And what I'd like to do following up is a summary. I'll do a webinar, a summary of the dynamic leadership, and do it as a webinar so we can have some interaction with the audience and get some questions. Meanwhile, just feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn. I'll pick up on that and then get back to you. All right? You take care. Thanks for showing up.